I found myself riding in the flatbed of an F-150 pickup truck down the Bruckner Expressway, taking pictures of guys doing wheelies on dirt bikes.
Welcome to episode 4 of Art Design Music. I'm Judd Haynes, a graphic designer and illustrator from Newfoundland, Canada. After the launch of our first 3 episodes, I want to say thanks so much to everyone that gave them a listen and reached out to cheer us on. There's been lots of emails and social media ads, all making us feel great about what we started here. You can find the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Art Design Music Podcast, but we don't bother with no Twitter. A complete list of guests for our first season is posted now on our website at artdesignmusic.com, which also includes full show notes for today's episode with Janette Beckman. Janette is an incredible photographer, and we've gone ahead and posted almost every photo she speaks about, so you can follow along. Just head to the episodes page, and you'll see the link to Janette Beckman. I let a couple folks hear these interviews as I was completing them, and today's conversation was one of their favorites. I know you're going to love hearing Janette's story. Her iconic photographic eye has been sought out by so many of the world's biggest acts, and she's worked tirelessly to make sure that they have a great experience while also sharing intimate pieces of themselves with her camera. Janette is also an absolute trooper. I had a last-minute software problem, and I had to switch computers just as we were about to hit record. I thought everything with the new computer was set, and we dove in, but it turns out that my studio microphone wasn't connected properly, so all of my audio in this episode was recorded using the terrible onboard microphones built into my 10-year-old backup laptop. Oh, it's so frustrating. I didn't have my own voice playing back in my headphones, so I didn't realize that every paper shuffle, every squeak of my swivel chair, and every nervous tap of my finger on the desk was coming through loud and clear in Janette's headphones. And she never said a word. She carried on like a pro and never let on that my background noises were probably distracting as hell. I had to send her an apology when I sat and listened to the playback and realized how insane my side of the recording had gone, and she acted like she barely noticed. What a sweetie. Janette, you're a total star and one of the most patient, lovely people I've ever met. So sorry. Oh my. Stay tuned after the conversation for details on how you can ask Janette a question on air during our 11th episode. It's a show we're dedicating entirely to our listeners. For now, though, let's dive into our chat with iconic music photographer Janette Beckman. When I was 13, the girl that lived a couple doors down introduced me to the Sex Pistols' debut record, Nevermind the Bollocks. I hadn't heard anything like this at this point. Most of the music I was listening to was pop acts on the radio or just some 70s rock groups that my parents were into. This Nevermind the Bollocks record included the harshest lyrics and by far the craziest sounding guitars I'd ever come across. The band were broke up by the time that I discovered they existed, but this record is still one of my favorites of all time. In the early years of eBay, the collector in me managed to track down first print British pressings of Nevermind the Bollocks and all 4 7-inch records the band put out between 75 and 78. The teenage me was buried in books about the British punk scene, staring into black and white photos and wondering what the scene must have been like at those concerts, which, Janette, you were there. Many of these photos that I adored as a teenager, you took. I'm so happy you're here.
Wow, thank you. Great to be here. I think the first shoot I did with the Sex Pistols was for press, and I was shooting them with a friend. We basically just spent the day with these guys, and you know, it was before they had gotten totally famous, so we were just all hanging out. We went to Hyde Park. They jumped in a dumpster. We took pictures. You know, then we went down to where they were rehearsing and took pictures down there. Then they blew up, and they said the F word on TV, on British TV, which was shocking to the whole nation. And they became very, very famous. And, you know, about a year later, I was at a Clash concert photographing that, and Steve Jones jumps on stage with Jimmy Percy, and they're all, I mean, it was a sort of ultimate punk concert. They were all playing together. That was really amazing. Got pictures of that. And then I was working for Melody Maker, which was a British weekly magazine, newspaper. And I went with my friend Vivian Goldman, the writer, to photograph Pill, which was Johnny's new band after he left the Sex Pistols. So that's how I ended up at Johnny's house taking pictures of the gang hanging out.
For some reason, there's Johnny's walking around with a big rifle in his hand for a few of the shots.
Well, Johnny's crazy. I mean, he was a wild guy, and I was just there. I don't really pose my subjects, so it wasn't like I said, pick that gun up and let's take a picture. He probably picked it up, and I was just, took the picture. I got a lot of people in that one shoot at his house. People were hanging out, that we were drinking, smoking, and then later that evening, we went out to a pub, and I feel like I remember we were all standing outside, and I remember Johnny pissing in a beer mug, which was just like the ultimate punk thing. But by then, I put my camera away, so it's just a memory. London, even though it's a huge city, punk was kind of a small movement, and either you were in or you weren't in. If you knew about it, everybody would go to each other's concerts. And even though there were all these rival movements, Rockabilly Kids, the Skinheads, the Mods, and of course the punks, even though they were supposed to, have rivalry, they still went to each other's concerts. And especially, when the two-tone bands started to come up, everybody would go to the Specials concerts. They would and the Clash, really. I mean, they all supported each other. They were all friends. A lot of them were living in squats around, North London. And, everybody just knew each other.
And you mentioned a couple minutes ago about Melody Maker magazine. Am I correct? Was that the first magazine that kind of got you shooting music in the first place?
Yes. So, well, kind of. There were 4 different weekly magazines. They were really newspapers. There was Sounds, Record Mirror, The Enemy, and Melody Maker. And the way I got introduced to it, one day I walked into Sounds, actually, which was sort of right near where I had my dark room with my portfolio. And I didn't have any music photography in there. I'd never photographed a band before, but I really love music. And I thought, well, I could do this. And I met this woman, the same woman, Vivian, that I mentioned. And she just said to me, well, there's a band playing tonight. Do you want to go photograph them? It's Susie and the Banshees. And I was like, okay. And I had to go. I'd never been a photographer at a live concert before, but I had to figure it out, how to shoot. There's definitely, things you have to do kind of technically with the ASA. It's before digital, remember, film. And so I went down to the Roundhouse where they were playing. I photographed Susie and the Banshees live, got some shots. I actually had gone after the concert. I took the film. I developed the film in my dark room. I made some prints, and I turned up the next day at Sounds, and they were like, oh, these are fine. Do you want to go and photograph another band? And then, shortly thereafter, I went from Sounds to work at Melody Maker. And they had a chief photographer, a lovely guy called Tommy Sheehan, and he was really into rock. So all those trips to America to photograph Led Zeppelin on tour and all of that, he got all that. And that left me, I was the second photographer, to do things that I loved, which was, all the punk and two-tone and soul and all the rest of it. So it was actually perfect. And I ended up shooting 2 or 3 bands a week for them from sort of like 1976 to the end of 82.
During that period, you photographed Stiff Little Fingers and the Ramones and Elvis Costello, the Clash, who you mentioned, Sex Pistols we mentioned, and there's the Jam, the Cramps, and Dexy's Midnight Runner. I mean, it seemed like it was a really quite exciting, fun period to be out shooting shows.
It was great. There was always something happening, and my darkroom was down the road from the Roxy, which was a punk club. There was something happening every night, and, the Melody Maker would send me to festivals. I was also working after a bit for the Face magazine. Would send me to some festival in Loch Lomond, and, there'd be all these different bands playing. And then I, of course, was not just photographing the bands, but I was kind of obsessed with the style and the look of the fans. So in between sets or whatever, there's always downtime. I'd go out in the audience and take pictures of people, And it was very exciting. And you really felt like, I don't know, you were sort of in it. You were part of something that was happening. And that punk movement, really changed British life as we knew it. So it was an exciting time to be around taking pictures.
You were filming a lot or taking shots of the fans and the fashion. And then that led to you end up doing actual like press photos or editorial photos and portraits of the bands. Were you being asked to take those kind of photos?
I always loved portraiture. And, one of the first shots that I remember taking of, people that looked amazing on the street were these two guys. They're called the Islington Twins. They were two guys. They are identical twins. And I was actually teaching in a college. And I came out at lunchtime, and there were these two guys standing in the schoolyard, dressed identically. And they looked amazing. And I had my camera, of course. So I took their photo, and that photo ended up becoming quite famous and being actually in the Victoria and Albert Museum, blown up to 12 foot high. Did a show about street style. So that was really cool. Cool for them, cool for me. I mean, Melody Maker would just send you out. There was never any art direction. If you were doing a shot, you'd just go out and they'd say, get pictures of, the undertones. You'd go on the road with the undertones for 2 days. And, sometimes you knew you were going to try and get the cover. So you would try and get like a shot for the cover, which, sometimes was black and white, sometimes it was color. Then you'd want some live pictures. You need a band picture. You need individual portraits. You just knew what you had to get. But that was as far as it went, as far as them trying to art direct me in any way. I was just on my own out there trying to do the best I could do. And, of course, all the shots of the fans never really made it into Melody Maker because it was about music and the musicians. But for me, it was great because now I have this whole archive of, what people were wearing on the street as opposed to, what the musicians were wearing. But the other thing is that you could be a fan one day and then next week you might be in a band, because punk music, you didn't have to be such an accomplished musician. You could jump on stage and, thrash a guitar and start screaming into a microphone and you're in a punk band.
Well, yeah, I mean, Sid Vicious is the prime example of that. I mean, he could barely play, but ended up suddenly in basically the biggest band of that time.
Incredible, right? Really incredible, yeah.
I've always been curious of the Clash photos that you took in Italy in 1980. What was going on there?
Well, it was a story for Melody Maker, and I was working with a writer called Paolo Hewitt. His mom was from Italy, but he'd never been there, so we went together to Italy. So that was really exciting for him, his first time kind of in his, homeland there. And the Clash were playing in a bicycle racing stadium. And somehow we managed to find our way there. We got to Milan. We managed to find our way to this bicycle stadium. And we just went downstairs to the dressing room, which was this strange kind of cave almost underneath the bike stadium. And there the band were. And by that time, they'd been down there for a while. They're all, smoking and drinking or whatever. And, I knew I had to get portraits of everybody and I had to get live shots. Paolo started interviewing them one by one. And then I was asking them if I could take a picture. So, I went up to Joe Strummer, who was sitting in a chair. And I was like, can I take a picture of you? And he goes, yes. And that's when he made that kind of fist thing. And I got that shot and I knew that was a good shot. And there was zero light. I hated using flash. I still hate using flash to this day. So you're down there, with a couple of light bulbs and you've got film and, it's not as forgiving as digital, that's for sure. So I knew I was going to have to push the film and everything. It was all a bit hairy. I got that picture of Paul Simonon. He's kind of looks like he's kind of resting by a mirror and there's a beer can. I mean, it's moody and it was a very intense atmosphere down there. I mean, that particular concert, after, we'd done all our pictures and the band was going on stage and we followed them, Paolo and I followed them. We were supposed to be on the side of the stage. And I guess, I don't know, it's embarrassing, but I had smoked something. I don't even remember what it was. And I'm standing on the side of the stage and the place is packed. Remember those little Bic lighters that people used to
Yeah.
have? So everybody's holding up their Bic lighters. It's Italy and they're all screaming in Italian and the band's, just kind of teasing them. They're just about to start. They're there, they're kind of warming up. And then they start playing. And I was on the side of the stage and I was so, how can I put it, fascinated, maybe hypnotized, that apparently I started walking. I had my camera up to my face. I'm looking through the lens, and apparently I started walking across the stage to get closer to Joe Strummer. And and I remember the roadie going, "Get that woman off the stage!" And somebody came and dragged me off, and I was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I did that." But I guess that's what happens when you smoke weed before you take pictures. It's a lesson learned.
Well, I'm glad you told me that story. I've always wondered about those photos, and I got to say, it almost doesn't surprise me that the story would have an odd ending, because it's, as you mentioned a second ago, the space that you were taking shots in and the band was hanging out in is such an odd space. And those photos have a different vibe to them than most kind of band photography. Like, you could just tell there was something strange about the space, strange about the vibe the band was in.
It was. It really was. And, well, it was an amazing concert to be at. And I'd photographed the Clash before in West London. And I just, they're one of my all-time favorite punk bands, 100% sure.
Do you remember the first record you were hired to photograph for, the cover or the jacket?
One of my images that I'd actually shot when I was in LA, and it's of some neon, was used on a Squeeze singles cover, which was great. And that's how I kind of got introduced to A&M Records. And then one day the art director called me up and he was like, "Oh, there's this new punk band and it's these three guys. Do you want to do that album cover?" And I was so excited. I was like, "Yes, of course, blah, blah, blah." We didn't have assistants or hair and makeup or stylists or anything in those days. So I actually took all my savings and went out and bought a Hasselblad camera, which is a square format camera because, it's an album cover and I needed a square picture. So you had this one camera, one lens, couple of film bags, and I went to meet the band with the art director. We decided to shoot in this tunnel, actually, under Waterloo Bridge. And that band was called The Police.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yep. And they were just three punk guys. I mean, I think Sting was a teacher at the time. Andy, of course, had been in the Animals. So, he was very accomplished. And then Stuart was Stuart. So.
Yeah, just a drumming genius.
Just a drumming genius, exactly. And his brother was their manager, Miles. Oh. And that was my first album cover.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. That's quite a debut.
Yeah.
For them and you.
Yeah. And honestly, if you look at all the photographs that I've shot of musicians in punk and hip hop, pretty much my whole life has been photographing bands just as they're about to break. It's very interesting, which is kind of great because then they don't have attitude and they don't expect anything. They're not, they can be very natural.
You mentioned earlier the Islington Twins and the portrait you took of them. I mean, they have gone on to become quite famous.
They have.
And I got to say, obviously, that it started with your photography. I don't know whether they would be as famous if it wasn't for you taking their shots. All these bands, the Police or whoever, that you were shooting them kind of when they were just starting out. I mean, there's a certain part of that you had a role in them blowing up as well. So it could be true. I mean, I'm very happy to play a small part. I mean, the Islington Twins, they weren't even in a band. They just used to hang around the Highbury Islington subway station outside. They would entertain the commuters coming out of the station. They had a boombox and they would do a little dancing and talk to people. It was great. It was such a great little scene, and they would do it pretty much every day, Monday to Friday. And they're great guys. Actually, I photographed them. Well,
maybe 4 or 5 years ago for a project in London. And they still dress identically. And we were just very happy to see each other after all these years.
Yeah, they're still kind of fashion icons in their own way.
They are. They are.
Would you approach photography for a record different than an editorial or a magazine shoot? I mean, obviously you did in the fact that you mentioned you went out and bought that Hasselblad. So you were thinking that now it's going to be a square format and you need to approach this in some sort of different way.
Well, it really depended on the band. I mean, the Police, I was there with the art director, who was holding up my strobe, by the way. So it wasn't like we didn't have assistants or anything. And, he had a certain idea of what this image should look like, and we discussed it. So anytime I worked with art directors, we talk about ideas and I try and, fulfill their dreams. But then on the other hand, they always let me do some of the things that I want to do as well. And that seems to work out really well.
A lot of records you did artwork for during that period were for either Rough Trade or A&M.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously you had a really good rapport with those art directors because they were hiring you time and time again.
I did. And yeah, I was very lucky. A&M was a great label. And yeah, I mean, I can't even remember all the bands. You probably know them better that I shot for A&M. And Rough Trade, it was a startup. They had a store and they had a label. And I knew Jeff, who was the owner, really well. And, you just go, okay, Janette, we need, pictures of the raincoats. Can you come down? And I'm like, okay, great. I go and take pictures of the raincoats. They were like a local, small label, kind of independent label that I loved working for. I shot so many of their bands over the years.
But Rough Trade are interesting because you can buy them. I mean, you can buy Rough Trade records now everywhere. And it's kind of, it's really quite a great success story. I mean, where I'm living in St. John's, Newfoundland is, a small city on an island right out of this weird little point in the Atlantic. And at our local record store, they have tons of Rough Trade records.
That's amazing.
So what I'm wondering is you had obviously a really great thing going. You've got success working with the record labels and magazines and the bands themselves. Many of which are now rising to become some of like the larger bands in the world, with the Clash and the Sex Pistols and the Police. So what was it that made you want to just pack it all up and end up in New York?
I think I can put it pretty much down to the fact that in 1982, the first ever hip hop rap tour came to London. In fact, came to Europe. We'd never really seen hip hop at all. I mean, we knew what it was, but we didn't really know what it was. And so I got the assignment to go down and photograph all the people who were staying in this kind of ratty little Airbnb, well, sort of like an Airbnb at the back of Victoria Station and nothing fancy. And I go down there in the afternoon and there are all these people hanging out and they have this sort of amazing energy. And that afternoon, I photographed incredible people: Africa Bambaataa, Grand Mixer DST, Fab Five Freddy, Ramel Z, Futura, Dondi, the Rocksteady crew. It's their first time in Europe. They're hanging out. They look really different style-wise to the punks. And the energy was great and very kind of, I don't know, they had this kind of positive energy. It's hard to describe. And I went to the concert at night to photograph what was going on. And it was crazy because, you have on stage Africa Bambaataa spinning. You've got Fab Five Freddy rapping. Futura and Dondi are painting a mural in the background. And then in front on the right-hand side, the Rocksteady crew are breaking all at the same time. And we had never seen anything like this before. And this was, I think, October, November of 82. And I was just taking photos. And the writer for the story, I don't think he really understood it. And he wrote something like, "This scratching is just a fad like skateboarding. It's not going to last." Now, in retrospect, it's hilarious.
Yes.
So he just didn't get it. But, I was due that Christmas to come visit a friend from art school who was living in New York. And so I came to New York with no intention of moving here. I just came for Christmas. And somehow or another, the energy here, I just started working and I never really went back. I went back to visit, not to live. I started working. I started getting jobs, and you know, in those days, Europe was really exciting. Trains were covered in graffiti. Kids walking around with boom boxes blaring, people break dancing on bits of cardboard on the street. And it had this really amazing energy that was very different from the English, the English energy, which was a little, punk, everything sucks, everything's dark, everything's gloomy. It was very different here. So that's kind of how I got here, to be honest.
The photos from that first show, I don't know if I've seen any of those.
Yeah, you could probably see some of them on my website. And also I've been posting them recently on Instagram because Futura just had a birthday, so I put a picture of him up, and they are out in the world.
So I probably have seen them then and just didn't realize they were from that particular show.
Yeah, it was really an education. It was my first exposure to graffiti and rapping and, mixing and breakdancing, just all of it. It was kind of like this Renaissance moment for me, I must say. When I got here and you could just see it all happening right in front of you, it was very exciting.
So you moved to New York, and then during this time, over the next couple of years, you end up shooting some of the earliest photos for LL Cool J, Run DMC, Beastie Boys, Public Enemy, Busta Rhymes, and you end up working with Salt and Pepper before they've even released a record.
Yeah, well, what happened was the British magazines that I had been working for all found out that I was in New York. And, the Brits are very obsessed with music. They always want to know what's going on. So they would call me up and go, in the case of Salt and Pepper, it was some teen magazine, which I can't even remember the name of, to be honest. And they called me up and said, well, we've heard about these girls, Salt and Pepper. Do you want to go take a picture of them? So, of course, it's work. I'm like, yes, of course. And they give you a phone number, you call, and Salt and Pepper and I got together. It was a hot day on the Lower East Side. We walked around in the neighborhood, Avenue B, C, and D, and just spent the afternoon just hanging out, taking pictures. And we got along really well. And they're like, oh, we have a record coming out. Would you like to be our record cover photographer? And I was like, sure, I'll do it. And that's how I got to meet Salt and Pepper and consequently take many, many pictures of them. Turned out that I did a lot of record covers for them. And, to me, Salt and Pepper really, they were some of the first women in hip hop, and they're very, very important. They were, before the Spice Girls, they were about, female power. When they wrote Let's Talk About Sex, I mean, that was an answer to all those boys who'd been talking about, the girl down the way and she's this and she's that. And then they come out and go, let's talk about sex. And it was the female power answer to all of that. And it was impressive, very empowering. And as you know, in the beginning, hip hop was quite male dominated. And, up comes Salt and Pepper and MC Light and, some of the female pioneers that changed the whole aspect, really.
And I heard that there's been some talk of recreating that really iconic photo with the jackets.
I think that has been over the years. I mean, they're doing really well. And those jackets, by the way, I didn't know at the time, but those jackets were made by the one and only Dapper Dan, who basically clothed everybody back in the day. And, I had the pleasure of working with him much later on when he started working with Gucci recently. So, he's a wonderful man and a brilliant designer. But yeah, that photo, it's true. If you want to go as a female hip hop artist, for Halloween, you're going to dress as Salt and Pepper. I mean, there's no ifs or buts about it. It's just like, it is an iconic photo. And I'm very proud to say that we took it together. And that, they just walked into my studio styled like that. It wasn't anything to do with me, the way they looked. But I think by that time, we were all so relaxed around each other that, the poses and everything, we just managed to pull it off. It was just, we just always had fun on our shoots.
But that was part of your thing, right? Was like you never really styled the bands. You let them kind of be themselves, which I think is probably why so many of these bands were that much more comfortable with you, because you weren't trying to force them to be something that they weren't. I super love your Slick Rick photo where he's holding his crotch with the bottle of champagne in his hand. Or like, say, the Rick Rubin photo where he's got like a gun for some reason. And it's just like those two shots are drastically different.
Yeah.
But you can tell that it's just two guys in separate shoots, just very relaxed, kind of having a moment of humor and fun and being themselves. And you're allowing that to happen.
Totally. Well, the way I used to do it in my studio, I would always have the backdrop set up and the lighting set up, and I'd have like a little, Sharpie marker where the person was supposed to stand. And then, we'd have a little hangout, we'd play music, and then I'd go, okay, let's take the picture. And whatever they did, all they had to do was sort of stay within the boundaries of my little marker just for the lighting. And they could do whatever they wanted. And I just was always ready. I didn't ask Slick Rick to grab his crutch. He did that on his own. I love that picture so much. To me,
so do I.
It says so much about hip hop attitude and, the fun element of it. And it's also fashion. I mean, he's wearing, I think it's a Ralph Lauren polo suit. He's got a skinny tie, Kangol beret. He looks fly.
And what's the bag he has by his feet in that photo?
I think it's Fendi.
Yeah, exactly. It's like everything in that photo is on, it's pretty great.
Yeah, and I didn't put that bag there either. He just went, stood on the spot, put the bag down, grabbed his crutch, and I'm like, this is it. This is the photo.
Yeah, he had to put the bag down because both of his hands were busy. He had his crutch in one hand and the champagne in the other, so he had nowhere to lay the bag but by his feet.
Totally. And it's kind of brilliant. I mean, and he also, Slick Rick, I think grew up in Britain. He's, he's from the UK initially, or maybe Jamaica via the UK to, I kind of got it. It's kind of a mod style in a way. It's kind of hip hop mod.
It is, yeah.
And I love that picture a lot.
I could ask you a million questions because there's so many specific, amazing photos. For the sake of our listeners, I'm just going to list off a few of the bands you worked with over the next short period of your career. We're talking about LL Cool J, Slick Rick, who we just mentioned. We've got Public Enemy, Busta Rhymes, who I mentioned earlier, Grandmaster Flash, MIA, Africa Bambaataa, EPMD, KRS-One, Tribe Called Quest, Rude Boys, Queen Latifah, like holy hell, Rocksteady Crew. Some of my favorite photos are your Rocksteady Crew shots, by the way. They're awesome.
Thank you.
He worked with Outkast, Method Man, Mary J. Blige, and we can go and go and go. This list is incredible. It's basically everybody who was anybody of that time. And what's amazing is so many of them are still going full tilt just as strong now. So you were embedded deep in the New York hip-hop community. It seems like it happened relatively quick, although I'm sure at the time there was a process. But did you find a big difference between the New York scene and the one in the UK?
Definitely, yeah. Growing up in London during that kind of punk era, you're pretty much like, it's dreary weather, this is shit and that is shit. And you're kind of looking, I grew up listening to Motown, and I think a lot of my generation grew up idolizing American music and R&B and all of this stuff. And, thinking that England was dreary and we were all pissed off with the Queen and the country and Thatcher when she came in. It was all pretty gloomy. We were pretty upset about the whole thing. And then you come here and somehow it's more of a positive atmosphere. I know it's kind of crazy, even though New York was also broke and in a terrible state when I got here. Same thing as punk in a way. There were a lot of similarities in that kids couldn't get jobs. The cities were broke, and you listen to a song like The Message from Grandmaster Flash and it will tell you exactly what it was like in New York.
Yeah.
Even where I was living, which is now called Tribeca, but, it was dark, there were rats everywhere, there were junkies, but somehow or another, it seemed to have this kind of vibrant atmosphere to me, possibly because I wasn't from here, but I was living in South London and there were a lot of skinheads in my neighborhood, and there were certain similarities. It was dark. You got off the train, there was like a tunnel that you had to pass under the railway line. And you wouldn't want to walk in that tunnel at night because the skinheads, could beat you up and steal your wallet. So it was a different type of danger here, but I think because I wasn't from here, I wasn't really aware of it.
Yeah, I've had that happen though. I've definitely traveled to cities and ended up out strolling around and walked through areas that afterwards people were kind of like blown away or shocked that you went through. So there is a certain naivete, I guess, to being on your own in a city and kind of figuring it out for yourself and not being afraid of the same things that everyone around you is afraid of, even if maybe you should be.
Totally. I know. That same thing happened when I photographed that Oyo Moravia gang in East LA in 1983. And I was obsessed with going to photograph them. I'd read a story about these guys in the LA Weekly or something, and there were no photos. So I got the journalist to take me there and introduce me. I spent a whole summer photographing these kids. And, everybody's like, that's the most dangerous area in LA right now. You shouldn't be going there. But they were all really nice to me. I didn't walk in the park. And I didn't realize I was in the middle of a gang war with another, rival gang. And there was like shootings, but I never really came across any of that. I was just kind of going to their houses and meeting their grannies and basically, taking portraits. But you're right. By the way, that's just come out as a book on Dashwood.
Oh, great. What's the book called?
It's called Oyo Moravia, which is the name of the gang. And it's a great little book. I mean, it's almost like a zine, really. It's a soft cover book, but it's great. And, I wasn't supposed to be there. And I'm lucky that nobody shot me.
So were you on an assignment or was this a self-initiated thing?
Self-initiated.
Wow.
Self-initiated lunacy, probably, but
yeah, self-initiated lunacy. We'll write that down. And that's great. And I'll post a link to this the book that we're talking about as well on the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah. In 2011, due to social media, I reconnected with these three girls that I have a picture of standing in front of a car, and they told me that when they heard about me, they thought I was crazy. They said, we heard about this crazy English woman who's hanging around in our park and we wanted to come down and see what was going on. And they're standing in front of this car, these three girls. It's one of my favorite pictures, actually. And we were discussing when I reconnected with them, what year was it? 1982 or 1983? They said, well, what color was the car? And it's a black and white photo. I was like, I'm not really sure. If it was silver, it was 82. If it was 83, it was blue, because we had to repaint the car because someone was shot and killed in the car and there was blood everywhere. And I mean, It's like, that's how you date.
Yeah. And this is just their reality at that moment. This isn't even a weird thing. This is actually just how they're time stamping this part of the conversation.
I know. And these three women are like best friends still. One works in the DA's office, one works in human resources and drives a Mercedes, and the other one works in gang rehabilitation. And all the guys in the book, pretty much most of them are in jail or dead. So
yeah,
it's a testament to their strength.
Yeah, and you went there for a whole summer, which is a testament to you. Lunacy might be a word that might come around a bit more often in your life, I think. So.
Oblivious to that.
So jumping back to music here with the in New York, you didn't only shoot hip hop. During all the same time, you shot a lot of the very first kind of photography for the electronic band Ministry.
Oh, wow. I've forgotten about them, yeah.
I remember in the 90s, they were one of my favorite acts. When they sounded much different a bunch of years later. They were less kind of electronic and more kind of like this heavy kind of juggernaut of a group.
Right.
Really popular on the summer festival scene. And then you worked with like Echo and the Bunnymen, a lot of pop acts like Simply Red, The Go-Go's, Boy George, Blondie, Sade, before Sade was even Sade.
That's right.
Bananarama, Niles Rodgers, and Joe Jackson. So you're becoming known as a photographer that musicians from all different genres like working with, not just punk and hip hop, even though those were kind of the ones that you've become synonymous with over the years. I'd like to ask you about your shoot with Tracy Chapman for the Fast Cars album and how you came to be working with her.
Well, what happened was we all knew about Tracy Chapman. She was amazing. And I guess her album was coming out. And they had done the album cover, but they needed press photos. I knew the press officer for this label. She called me into the office and she was like, look, we really don't have any money. We've been trying to get a good press shot of Tracy. We've hired 5 different photographers to shoot her, and she doesn't like any of the pictures. And the list went from, I think she'd been photographed by Annie Leibovitz. She'd been photographed by all these different photographers. And she's like, we really, we could give you $500. Do you want to photograph her? And I was just, yeah, sure, send her around. And Tracy came around to my studio and we just got along like a house on fire. She didn't come with anybody from the label. She just came on her own, and she's wearing this kind of a coat, nothing fancy. She's not dressed up. You can see in the pictures, she just looks like her. Brought her guitar. So we did a few studio shots. And then we just went for a walk in the neighborhood. And, I was like, how do you feel about sitting on this stoop? And she sits on the stoop. I get a picture of her. We walk down the road. We get a coffee. I've got a picture of her standing outside a fortune teller. We just spent the day, and our politics were very similar. So, obviously there was a lot to talk about. And we just got along really well. And that was it. Off she went. And then it turned out that they ended up using those pictures on 12-inch covers. And when she re-released her album a couple of years ago, apparently she had all the contact sheets from our session, and she wanted to use those pictures. And those were like her favorite pictures that she'd had taken over the years. And a lot of people shot her. So I was really honored. I'm a huge Tracy Chapman fan, and especially now with everything that's been going on, her music resonates more now than it ever did. And really, she's in a lane of her own. Nobody's ever taken that spot, in my view.
No, that record blew up and became so huge because nothing really sounded like it. And the quality of the songs were so amazing. And her reputation as an artist, and both in the music industry and just with fans, has never dwindled for even half a second.
Right. I don't think anybody can touch her, to be honest.
No.
She's unique. She has a unique voice. She's an incredible songwriter. And it's just so simple what she does, and so powerful.
And that comes through in the photo too, though. Like, I remember the photo is kind of like she's just kind of almost cradling the guitar, like slightly almost hiding behind it a bit.
Right. I think she's quite a shy person. She's not like a Madonna, you know what I mean? Like a star where they want to be dressed up and they want to have stylists. She was comfortable.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier too that you went on tour with the Undertones. The B-52s took you on the road with them.
I was a huge B-52 fan, and I knew them, and I'd already done a photo session, 1 or 2 with them. And it was just so much. I mean, the B-52s are the ultimate fun party band.
Yeah.
You just can't, you're listening to Love Shack every night and dancing around on the side of the stage. How much fun is that?
Yeah, and Rock Lobster.
Rock Lobster. In fact, I knew about the B-52s before I even came to New York, because I had a friend from LA had brought me actually a Cramps album and a B-52s album. And I'm like, what is this music? It's so great. So, yeah, I think we went to Boston, a bunch of other places on the Eastern Seaboard. And, it was just fun being around them and, watching Kate get her hair done. And there was a lot that went into that. I'd been on tour a lot with the bands, because especially during the punk era, where did I go? Somewhere like Blackpool with Echo and the Bunnymen. And I remember being in their tour bus with them, and they were playing this stuff that I had never heard before. It was like this psychedelic stuff. And it was that band called The Seeds. It's like psychedelic rock. I think it's an album called Golden Nuggets, but it's got the Zombies and the Seeds and all of those bands, which I was not aware of. So you'd kind of be in a tour bus and you'd get introduced to some completely different type of music. And that was always really fun. And, just hanging out with them. I always tried to be a fly on the wall, so we say, not, get in their face. But of course, there comes that moment when I have to get the band shot, in which case then you have to do your thing. But yeah, I mean, I went on a lot of tour buses, the Go-Go's. I photographed the Go-Go's a lot. And, I'm still good friends with them now. I'm working on a book, which is going to be, it's like a monograph of my 40 years of taking pictures. Sounds scary. But
that's awesome.
yeah, it's really cool. And Belinda just wrote this great quote for me about the LA punk scene back in the day. But yeah, the Go-Go's are a great band, another fun band to be around,
Yeah, my girlfriend plays in a really fun band here in St. John's called Thelma and Louise, and they do Go-Go songs and B-52 songs,
Really?
in the mix of all this other stuff. So yeah, she was very excited when I told her I was going to be talking with you, because it was like, say, a lot of her favorite bands are ones that you've worked with as well as mine. So
That's so cool. That is so cool.
when you're on tour, obviously you've got lots of time to work with these groups, but I know that it wasn't always that way. Sometimes you're only given a matter of like 10 or 15 minutes to kind of grab that perfect photo. There's quite a few famous photos out there now that you took of Blondie, but from what I understand, you only were given like a 15-minute window to grab whatever you can.
Oh, yeah. When I took that picture of Blondie, of Debbie Harry, and I'd just gone to their hotel room to get a picture for Melody Maker. And I can't remember if it was a cover story or not, but they were playing in London. And, they were probably doing a series of interviews, all day press. So I was the first one up in the morning. I'm knocking on the door of their hotel room at whatever, 10 o'clock in the morning. And, they don't want to leave the hotel room. Why would they? So I have to figure out, I've got to get a picture. There's daylight coming through the window. I really love that picture of her because she looks so beautiful. And at the same time, she's like a little vulnerable. It's early in the morning, and it's not like a lot of photographs of Blondie, studio photos where she's been, she's made up, styled, and she's ready to go. And she looks amazing. But this is just her in the morning. They probably just got up. I actually had dinner with her at this gala a year or so ago. And I had that Blondie picture on one of my business cards.
Oh, cool.
And we were sitting at the same table, and she was getting up to leave. And I was like, Debbie, I just want to give you this. And she looked at it and she goes, that was a really great wig. And I was like, yeah, I just thought she was going to say that was a really great photo. That's all she said. That was a really great wig. And all along, I thought it was her own hair, like an idiot.
Yeah. So did I up until now. Yeah. Well, I've seen because you posted the contact sheet for that shoot at one point too.
Yeah.
There's a certain, almost a shyness and a vulnerability to the beginning of that shoot. Probably where, again, they don't know you quite yet and you're in the hotel. By the end of the shoot, there's the couple shots where there's the two of them in the shots, and they're like smiling and laughing, and their eyes are like almost closed. And it's like, there's like a whole other level of relaxation that came from over that 10 to 15 minute window.
It's amazing. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. It's not a tech thing. It's just, being able to relate to people. And by nature, I used to be a very shy person. So I understand, at some point, you have to respect people and talk to them and make them feel at ease, because I know what it's like. So I'm very sympathetic to, it's not, it's hard. It's hard work being a rock star. So I'm very sympathetic to anybody who comes in front of my lens. It's a collaboration. It's a true collaboration between me and them. And my task is to make them feel at ease enough to show me who they really are. And then I shoot quite quickly. Hopefully they leave and they had a good time, which I think is why a lot of them kept coming back for more, because, I make it so easy. Right now I'm working with this startup label called Rainbow Blonde, and Jose James, who's a really great jazz singer, if you guys don't know him.
I was going to ask you about him, actually.
Oh, good. Maybe I should just wait till you ask the question then.
Well, sure, if you like. Yeah, I have him. I have a couple questions about him for later on.
Oh, all right. I'll talk about him later. But
Okay, sure. I had one funny Blondie thing that I just thought of while you were talking about them a moment ago. I used to live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they played a show there probably only like 15 years ago. I was out of town the weekend of the concert, but the following weekend I was back and I was getting a taxi and a Blondie song was on the radio. And the taxi driver, you could tell, couldn't wait to tell his Blondie story as soon as the song started. He said that last week he had picked up Debbie at the airport and was driving her into the city. She had just flown in and she got in the car and he was like, so where are we headed? And then she said, take me where the punks hang out.
wow.
And he was just kind of like, huh? And she's like, yeah, whatever bar or hangout where the punks go, that's where I want to go.
Wow.
And so he dropped her off at a bar called the Seahorse, which is exactly where the punks would hang out. And she went in, he said suitcase and all, like she took her suitcase out of the back of the car and went in. And now I have no way to verify if that story is even true.
That's a great story.
I want to go where the punks hang out.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. That is a great story. Wow.
So a bunch of years go by now, and I mean, not that many years, really. We're talking like early 90s. But you spent most of the 80s documenting kind of America's hip-hop rise, and you decide to publish a book about the community and realize you don't have enough West Coast bands or acts covered. So you head to LA to shoot NWA, and you got to tell me what happens next.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what happened because this book, Rap, Portraits and Lyrics of a Generation of Black Rockers, very long title. I was doing it with my good friend Bill Adler, who was the PR at Def Jam at the time. He was doing the writing, my photos, and I was like, we need some West Coast stuff. So I managed to get in touch with NWA's record label and then their manager. It was one of the first books about hip hop. I mean, we were a little ahead of our time, to be honest. And I wanted to get a shot of the band. So I go down there to the recording studio and they're busy recording. They don't really want to come out and have their photo taken, but they do it. And it's on a street in LA. They're out. It's a hot day. And I see this cop car coming down the street. So I thought, great, because can I say this word?
Say any word.
Oh, so fuck the police had just come out. And I thought, oh, great, I'm going to flag down this cop car and get a picture of them with the cop car. So I flagged down the cop car and to stop, and I was like, would you mind if I just photograph this pop group in front of your car? He's like, no, sure, no problem, little lady. So I got, they're all standing in front of the cop car, and I got that shot. It was so crazy. And I think they were a little, nervous maybe, because it could have gone
definitely
west. It could have gone sideways, whatever. Anyway, so I got my shot, and that was exciting. And I did a few portraits in the alley. And then we go inside, and they say to me, am I supposed to tell this story? Is this They say to me, we love your accent. We love your British accent. Would you mind reading something for our new album that we're doing? So I look at it. That's like, okay, give it to me. It sounded great. I was going to be on an NWA album. And the whole thing was basically about giving a perfect blowjob, how to give that they'd written out, and rhyming, blah, blah. And I guess with my British accent, it would have sounded amazing. But at the time, I was kind of, in this kind of, it went against my feminist grain. I was like,
Of course.
I just can't. So I had to politely refuse, but that...
Well, yeah, and the group is so big at that time. It's not like it's like a little inside joke for you and your friends. This is something that's going to go out into the stratosphere, and we'd still be talking about it decades later. So
I know, I wish I'd done it now in retrospect. But, and then, anyway, and that same day I went to photograph Ice Cube because by then he'd left the band. And, he was at his mom's house, and I got a picture of him and his mom. And she's so proud of him, and he's doing so well, and that was cool, standing on the stoop of his mom's house.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that photo too, actually, and not really anything more than you just said, but I was wondering if that was taken on the same trip or not, because I love that photo. It's such a heartwarming, cute photo of the two of them.
Oh, who'd have thought?
That shot of NWA in front of the cop car, I feel like is the only photo I've ever seen of the group where they look rattled. Like they look definitely like they're like uncomfortable and are a little bit kind of like, what is going on right now? And but like you say, "Fuck the Police" is like this massive song at this point, and here they are. You just flagged down a police officer to come over, and they're now suddenly posing in front of it. So I can see why they're kind of a little bit like, oh my god. And then that Ice Cube and his mom photo is the same thing. Like Ice Cube at this point. And now I know as he's gotten a bit older, his kind of like persona has come around a lot more in different ways. But at that time, he only ever played a hard ass.
Right.
And so here it was, this moment. It's like the only photo I've ever seen of him from this era where he's actually like really loose and relaxed and smiling. And he's there with his mom, and his mom is like so happy and excited that they're getting the picture taken together. Both of those photos are really special, and they're very different from any other photos of those artists from that period.
Yeah, I know. Ice Cube with his mom. That is a great moment to me.
So I've been asking you a lot about music photography, but I also want to spend a moment and talk about your work outside of music. You also have shot many of America's top street and graffiti artists, including Say Adams, Keith Haring, Shepard Fairey, Ian Wright, David Cho, Futura, who we mentioned a couple times already here today, and then Jules Muck, just to name a few. Was it this relationship with these artists and these street artists that led to your mashup series?
Well, the way the mashup series happened was that Say Adams and I were asked to do a show, an exhibition, and we were trying to think of something really cool to do. And Say just suddenly came up with the idea that he was going to get 10 of his friends to draw on my hip hop photos. And I was at the time a little skeptical that this was going to be a good idea. I was like, why are they going to want to draw over my photos? And he's just like, just wait and see. And basically, that's how I got introduced to all these people. So initially, 10 of his friends to reinterpret my hip hop pictures. And all these people were allowed to look through my archive, choose something that meant something to them. So, if somebody's like a huge, Ice Cube fan, they would choose that. Or if you're a Public Enemy fan, maybe you chose Chuck D or whatever. And we had this little exhibition in my loft at the time to launch it. And 500 people turned up. It was a sunny day, and
wow,
we had a beer sponsor, luckily. And it was like a huge success.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was awesome. And so it just started with 10 artists. And that's how I got introduced to all these people. And then we showed the exhibition in a place in Chelsea. And, Zephyr, who happened to be walking by, came and looked at it. And he was like, I want to do one. And then we showed it somewhere else, and then somebody else. And then we bump into Futura, and he wanted to do one. And in the end, we got 30 artists. Wow. And I'd taken this show around the world. Well, it'd been in Paris, it was in Geneva, it was in London, it was in LA, it was by Yale. It had been traveling because the actual pieces were 11 by 14, so it's sort of an easy little thing to put in a box. Yeah. And it just grew into this great thing. And then it became a book, which was published by my gallery, the Fahey Klein Gallery in LA. You can still buy the book on Amazon. And it's just such a great project. And part of the project was that I do portraits of all of the artists. So that was really good. I don't know. It's a very special project. And we have just done a punk mashup project now with 10 different punk artists. And so this whole mashup thing has developed into this great thing. And we kind of became this like community of artists. Mm-hmm. And it led to me doing a lot more artist portraits. And
is there a book for the punk series?
Not yet.
And can folks buy prints?
They can. They have to go to industryprintshop.com, and then I think you go in the shopping thing, they'll find it. But yeah, I could send you the link. But yeah, they're $100. They're silk 18 by 24 silkscreen prints.
Amazing.
They come with a certificate of authenticity. They're really beautiful. I mean, it's hard now, in COVID, to actually do things that we would love to have a huge opening for the punk mashup, but
I could picture there being a book at some point of just the portraits.
And that would be great. I mean, I'm definitely going to put some of the portraits from the first mashup series in my book that I'm doing with Drago, which is coming out 2022 spring.
And what is this book?
This book is called Rebels from Punk to Dior.
Cool.
Yeah, and it's got your friend Slick Rick on the cover. And
Nice.
actually, Say wrote Rebels for me in a beautiful handwriting. It's going to be an amazing cover, but it's kind of the history of my photography. So it starts, back in 76, 77, Susie and the Banshees, all the punk stuff going through, your Johnny Rotten, everybody. Then it goes through hip hop. Then there's artists and creatives, which, would include Tracy Chapman and Lee Bowery and, some writers and obviously portraits of Keith Haring and Art Say, and Jules Mark is definitely going to be in there since you mentioned her. I have a lot of, Thundercat, George Clinton. I've got a lot of stuff.
You know who I didn't hear you mention?
Who, which?
I haven't heard you mention Carol Spinney, the man behind Big Bird.
Oh, that's funny. Yes, I did. Yeah, I know. That was fabulous, though. I know, and he lived in the country in this fabulous kind of estate with all these different types of birds and geese and things wandering around. He really was a bird lover, that man. He was a lovely guy. Anyway, and then there's like street portraits from all sorts of places. The Gohard Boys, which are a dirt bike group that I photographed from Harlem. New York portraits. I went to the Indy 500 last year and got pictures from there and all sorts of places, Omaha, Nebraska, and everywhere. And then there's a kind of fashion, how it leads into fashion. Levi's and Dior and
yeah, because you've worked for Levi's, Dior, who you mentioned. You also worked for Gucci and Dapper Dan.
right.
We talked about Dapper Dan with the Salt and Pepper jackets earlier.
Yeah.
Ebbets Field, Kangol, Fry Boots. Like the fashion industry has become a big part of your story now as well.
I was very lucky in the fact that, let's say the creative director of Dior is a wonderful man, liked my hip hop and punk pictures, but he also liked everything I'd been doing ever since. And that's why he hired me to do, first I did the 2018 worldwide campaign for them. And it was one of the greatest jobs I've ever had in my life.
Oh, that's awesome.
3-day photo shoot, block party. We had models, but we also were picking kids off the street and just popping them into a Levi coat. One point, there were these two fabulous older ladies came out and they were, what's going on here? And we threw trucker jackets on them and got a picture of them. I mean, it was really, really fun.
This wasn't like a one-time deal. Like working with fashion photography is kind of become another one of the tools in your tool belt now.
I think it is. Yeah. I mean, the Kangol things, we photographed punk bands that were contemporary punk bands in London and also in Manchester. We did a couple of shoots for them. So we're photographing real bands in their hometowns, wearing their own clothes, or sometimes we'd have a stylist, augment their own clothes, and in Kangol hats. So it was really great on the streets where they lived. So it's very authentic. All of it is very authentic.
Well, and your relationship with Kangol has gone on for decades. I remember that massively iconic LL Cool J photo where he's wearing a Kangol hat. And the logo was front and center right up there next to the boombox he has on his shoulder.
Yeah.
And I mean, that photo is, almost like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame photo now.
Yeah, that's actually true. Well, as a kid, I used to wear Kangols.
Mm-hmm. They're back again now. It's all back.
Yeah. I mean, they're a 100-year-old brand, I think, now.
Well, I just got a couple more things I wanted to ask you about, and then I'll let you go because I know your time is really valuable, and you've given me a lot of it here already this afternoon.
Judd, it's COVID. Every day goes one into another, but go ahead.
I know every day feels like Monday and every day feels like Friday.
It's really true.
A few moments ago, you mentioned the Gohard Boys.
The Gohard Boys are a dirt bike club or maybe gang collective that live in Harlem, and I got introduced to them by a friend. I was working for a British magazine called Jocks and Nerds at the time, and I thought it would be a perfect story for them. These guys ride dirt bikes. It's actually illegal to ride a dirt bike in the city, but they do it so that kids don't do drugs and, they're into their bikes instead. It's the whole thing about bike culture. And they live in Harlem, and dirt bikes are kind of lighter, like you could keep them in your apartment if you had to. First, I had to get introduced to them. So I go to meet the CEO, this guy Shay, and I brought my hip hop book to show him, just kind of street cred wise. And we're sitting on a stoop up in Harlem, and we look down. We're both wearing the same Converse sneakers. And he looks at me, goes, "You took all these pictures?" I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Okay, I'm going to hook you up. Come up next week." So my first shoot with them, one of my greatest moments of all time, I found myself riding in the flatbed of an F-150 pickup truck down the Bruckner Expressway, taking pictures of guys doing wheelies on dirt bikes on the freaking Bruckner Expressway. It was a really hot summer's day, and they were like, "Are you okay back there?" And I'm like, "I have never been happier." It was so cool. The thing ended up running, like a 10-page spread in this magazine, this British magazine. And then we've just stayed friends. And anytime they need photos, I go up there. And when Trayvon Martin was killed, they had a whole protest, and I went up there and photographed it. And, now if they need photos, they just call me, and I give them everything, and they can use them for whatever they want. And they're just a really great collective. It's really like a big, giant family.
Yeah, it's a cool story. I do think it's such an interesting club and initiative, and what they're doing for the community while at the same time doing something totally illegal in the community.
Totally.
And so it's really an interesting and beautiful kind of thing they have happening.
It is. It's beautiful. Yesterday I was sitting in a cafe, and somebody came by on a dirt bike doing a wheelie, and you hear them because it's noisy, and we're like, "Whoa, look at that!" I mean, it's just great. It's a great culture, and I really admire them. And you're right, what they do for the community, it makes community, and that's what it's all about.
Another thing you mentioned in that part of it, when you're talking about being on the back of the flatbed, it again comes back to this interesting side of your character, this bravery side, where you're basically always up for whatever, between spending the summer with the gang or even just throwing yourself right in the middle of the punk scene or in the middle of the hip hop scene when it's starting out. But I did know there was one shoot in particular that did scare you a little and knock you a little bit off your game. Can you tell me a little bit about your foray into New York's illegal girls fight club scene?
Oh, yeah. That was really crazy. I had these friends that were making a documentary about these illegal girl fights that were going on in East New York, which is a difficult neighborhood. I think Mike Tyson actually came from that neighborhood, interestingly enough. They were making a documentary and they wanted some stills. So we went to Brownsville, and it was in the winter. It was at night. And I brought my friend Ben with me, who's another photographer, just to kind of help keep an eye on my cameras and stuff. And we go to this big cement garage in a darkly lit street in Brownsville in the middle of winter. They've got a boxing ring built in there. And, there's pit bulls tied up in the back. They've got security at the door, and the place is packed with all the local badasses. The thing is actually sponsored by, I think, the local drug dealers, and they sponsor these girls to fight, and they have to fight barefisted. They're not wearing gloves, and they've got to fight. I think it was something like 3 minutes. And if they don't fight hard, they don't get paid. And the one that wins get paid more than the one that loses. And it's just this enormous garage was packed with people who I didn't know. I didn't know any of them apart from the film crew who was filming them. And I don't know, I felt a little nervous thinking, well, if somebody has a gun and they decide to start shooting, which would be quite likely, we're here with all these drug dealers and the local hoodlums, it could really get nasty, and you're locked in as well. That was the other thing. They chain locked the doors.
Wow.
And that made me a little scared. But then, I'm there with my friend Ben, and we're talking, and, I was like, you know what, I'm here now, so whatever. I'm just going to pick up my camera. And I just start going up to people going, "Do you mind if I take your picture?" And everybody, they're all happy to pose. And within about 5 minutes, I'd forgotten my fear, and I'm right in there taking pictures of the girls in the ring. And it was actually a great assignment. And then I ended up doing a few more shoots, centered around this, going to some, little parties that people had and photographing the characters and the moms. Because what it is, these girls fight to make money. We were following this one woman who was fighting to make money so she could get her family out of the neighborhood, which is kind of a dangerous neighborhood. She wanted to move to somewhere in Pennsylvania, and she was hoping to win the jackpot that night so that, they could leave. And so I ended up photographing her and her family and her mom and her grandma and the generations and the kids getting haircuts in the barber shop. And, I went back a good few times. And it was a great project, actually, to work on. But that's probably not one of the smartest places to be on a dark night.
So this year has been, obviously for both the USA and the world, it's been a really hard one. Between COVID and the election, and then all the police violence and systemic racism. So it's been just an incredible year of rebellion and kind of uprising. I noticed you've been taking your camera out with the protesters and kind of documenting all that as well.
Yeah. I'm lucky enough to live in an area between Tompkins Square and Washington Square and Union Square, which is, have always been traditional places of protest. And first when COVID shut New York down completely, I was going out and photographing the deserted streets and, what wasn't going on. It was really spooky. And then the protests started and it was great. I just was inspired to go out and photograph the protests because obviously, it's something I really believe in. And the Black Lives Matter movement,
Yeah, it's intense.
It's intense. And what they've done, it was just so great to see all these kids marching and expressing their point of view. And, they basically changed the course of this election, thankfully. And
yeah.
So, there was I found out where the Instagram sites where there was one called Justice for George, and you could find out where the demonstrations were happening in your neighborhood. And I just ended up going and following the demonstrators, taking pictures, and walking with them. There were a lot of bike demonstrations that started happening. I ended up riding with the bike demonstrators, trying to navigate my bicycle with a camera in hand, taking pictures, which also is kind of not so smart. But, I just felt it was really important to be a part of it. And I felt like I was witnessing a moment in history. And obviously I wasn't around during the civil rights of the 60s, but I felt like this was almost as important. I mean, it's a turning point in history. We've never been in a situation like this. A, COVID, and B, as you mentioned, the election. And the last 4 years, I was at the Women's March. I've been at a lot of marches in my life for various justices and, Rock Against Racism in London back in the day and, AIDS activism and all of that. But this is a really important time. And I'm really grateful that I went out and photographed. And these weren't paid assignments. It was just something that I felt compelled to do, to be honest.
Yeah, I can absolutely understand why. I mean, if I was living there, I would be out there as well. As always, Janette, you find yourself in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you say you're kind of at the precipice of a moment in history. It does seem like most of your life you've been walking into the precipice of another moment in history, and it's kind of amazing. Thank you very much for telling me that. I do feel a little bit weird jumping from something so real into something a bit more light, but we did say a moment ago that we were going to talk about Jose James when we kind of shelved it for a second. So I do want to circle back with Jose. I mean, you've been working with him more in your kind of recent part of your career. You've done like kind of press photos and album covers and shoots in other countries. I'm kind of wondering kind of how this has developed, not necessarily specifically with him, but how your craft is different now than it would have been when you were working with these groups kind of in the late 70s or the 80s. How has the game changed?
Well, I first photographed Jose for the same British magazine that I photographed the Gohard Boys, which was called Jocks and Nerds. And I was their New York photo editor, which meant basically I could just go and shoot whatever I wanted. That was their first assignment they gave me, was Jose James. So it's just a photograph of him. I didn't know who he was. I became a huge fan of his music, and shortly after that shoot, he was doing his first album with Blue Note, and he asked me if I wanted to shoot the cover. We've developed this kind of working relationship, basically, and we're firm friends at this point. I just think he's a great singer. I think what he does is amazing. And actually, I just did a photo shoot with him and his wife on Monday, in fact, just outside. Yeah, just because they're going to drop a couple of albums each, I think double albums each. So we just came up with an idea. But we have a great collaboration. We come up with ideas and we just execute them. And, I think he's totally at ease with me. And, we're friends. We hang anyway on the regular. For anybody who doesn't know who's Jose James, they should go check him out.
Yeah, I had never heard of him.
No, he's great. You should check him out.
Yeah, and well, I came to him through your photography.
Oh, that's
how I
cool.
kind of discovered him. It was like I saw you had photographed him, and then a little while later you photographed him again, and then it's like I'm looking through and I'm seeing, oh wait, you photographed this man multiple times, and so then I'm realizing, I'm like, well, there's something here, and it's obvious that it's not just standard photos. Just like you mentioned a minute ago, there's a friendship has developed, and so then I'm kind of like, oh well, now I need to go and see what this music sounds like. It's an extension of our conversation with Tracy Chapman or with Salt and Pepa, where it's kind of like you've developed a relationship now with Jose James, and not just the music, but the person. And I wanted to see how that kind of related to the way that you photograph now. Has that changed from the way that you were photographing in the late 70s when you were just a kid running around with the punks?
In a way, my photography hasn't changed that much in that, this last shoot that we did is pretty similar to any band shoot. We decided we wanted to shoot in these handball courts, which are about, 10-minute walk from my house. And, we just kind of do it. We just take a walk. What do you think of this? The shadows, yeah, it looks good. We'll take the shot. And that's pretty much, I hate to say, pretty much what I would do if I was taking a picture of, the undertones in Birmingham or, it hasn't changed that much. And I think, I hate to use that word authentic, but I just try and keep it real and, there's no bullshit. And mostly unless it's a big fashion shoot or something, I don't have assistants, and it's just me and the band. And it's pretty much always been like that. So, with a fashion shoot, I try and, I really like the street stuff. So I try and still shoot street stuff. That's why Dior, the last shoot I did for them, which was in London, we were shooting these incredible models dressed in the most beautiful clothes on the same streets as I had shot punk bands, literally in Kentish Town, and the same walls. And that's incredible. How many years later,
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. It's rare most of us bear witness to one cultural or artistic uprising, but between the birth of UK punk, America's rise with hip hop, and all the various art scenes that it kind of came along with hip hop, your street photography leading up to and including this year's protests, I feel like you've been at the front lines documenting the world for all of us forced to watch at a distance, like, say, myself on this little island in the Atlantic.
Wow.
I want to thank you for flagging down the cop during the NWA shoot and making that magic moment happen, or reaching into your camera, or not putting away your camera when Johnny Rotten decides to sport a rifle at his party, and taking all these magic kind of photos, and even the live photos of the Clash and the Wu-Tang Clan, for not being timid, and for basically giving a chance to show us the real world of these underground gangs, the women's fight clubs. From this conversation, what I glean is your biggest gift seemed to be your ability to make people feel very comfortable in your presence, in front of your lens. And even for me here on the other side of this microphone, I'm so very honored that you spent a little bit of time with me today discussing your art and your impact on the music industry. Thank you so much.
Jad, thanks so much for having me. And I really appreciate all those kind words. And, I feel blessed that I've had these amazing opportunities to just walk around in the world with my eyes open and take pictures. It's a good life.
It's a special gift. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say that Janette Beckman is one of the most interesting, talented, and kind professionals on the go. I loved every moment of that conversation and hope you did as well. We only scratched the surface of her incredible career today, and I know I keep coming back to it over and over again, but her bravery to time and time again march right to the front of so many of the world's emerging historic musical and social movements is nothing short of astonishing and absolutely inspirational. Not long after we concluded this chat, I found a couple of Janette's photography books in my mailbox signed by Janette. One of those books could be yours. If you'd like to have your name added to the draw, there's a number of ways you can do so. 1. If you're following our Instagram or Facebook, which you can find at Art Design Music Podcast, then you're already entered. And if you're not following one or both of those accounts, then there's still time. Get on it. And 2. Send in an email question or comment about today's episode to artdesignmusicpodcast@gmail.com. I asked Janette if she'd be willing to come back on our final episode of the season to answer a listener question or two, and she agreed. Everyone who sends in a question or comment will be entered in the draw for the book. Record yourself asking your question if you can, as we'd love to hear your actual voice, and make sure you tell us your name and where you're from. Now, if you don't want to record yourself and would rather just type your question, that's totally cool too, no pressure. Again, the email address is artdesignmusicpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to learn more about Janette Beckman, you can find her all over social media. Her Instagram is @JanettePhoto, that's JANETTE photo, and her website is JanetteBeckman.com. Many of her prints from the Mashup series are for sale on her website, so go get yourself some art music history and dress up those walls. Speaking of buying stuff, we've added some merch to our website. You can get a t-shirt that says Art Design Music, 3 of my favorite things. There's also stickers, beanies, and cute little enamel pins. Find those on the merch page at artdesignmusic.com. As always, I want to thank my bud Lowell Campbell for performing and recording all the drum beats you heard in this and every episode of the podcast. I've been so honored to have him learning new beats for every show and love hearing his take on so many classics. You can follow him on Instagram at Lowell Campbell, and he has a debut solo album coming out soon where he plays nearly every instrument. Plus, his main band of the last 20 years can be found at wintersleep.com. Now, before I go, I want to tell you about what's coming up next. It's widely known that the second biggest selling album of all time is a little number called Back in Black by AC/DC. I'm betting with the sheer mention of their name, you're instantly picturing that iconic AC/DC logo. Well, on episode 5, I'll talk to Gerard Huerta and get the story behind the logo he designed for the band over 40 years ago. He'll talk about what inspired it and how it was created in an era long before computers. He's a master lettering designer and has worked his craft for everyone from Bob Dylan to Cher, Blue Oyster Cult, Boston, HBO, Swiss Army Watches, Star Trek, Pepsi, Time Magazine, and a ton more. Letterform nerds are going to love this one, and music fans too, of course. Anyway, we'll save that for next episode. Thanks again for listening. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you haven't done so already, leave us a little review if you're enjoying what you've heard so far. I'm Judd Haynes, and this has been episode 4 of Art Design Music.